where we uncover the cases that continue to raise questions long after the headlines have faded. From unexplained disappearances and shocking murders to investigations filled with hidden details, we examine the evidence, the timeline, and the people at the center of each case. Some stories are difficult to hear, some remain unsolved, and others reveal how a single overlooked detail can change everything. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at one of those cases. So, let's begin. There was something about the flowers that bothered Sadie Hartley a week before she was murdered. Sadie was at home when a woman she didn't recognize appeared at her front door wearing a baseball cap and carrying a small bunch of chrysanthemums. There was no card attached to them and no explanation as to who they were from. But the woman knew Sadie's name, handed over the flowers, and then walked away. It was a strange thing to happen, and Sadie was sufficiently unsettled by it that she immediately contacted her partner, Ian Johnson, to ask where the flowers had come from. They hadn't come from him. Sadie then told Ian that the woman had known her name, adding that she found that particularly worrying because she was at home on her own on a dark evening. She also mentioned the incident to her friend Julie the following day. Given that Sadie's home had been burgled several months earlier, it was understandable that she was already feeling slightly more vulnerable than she normally would have done. What Sadie couldn't possibly have known was that the flowers were not really flowers at all, at least not in the sense that she understood them to be. They were part of something else. 7 days later, another woman would arrive at Sadie's front door, and this time, Sadie would not survive the encounter. Sadie lived in Helmshaw in the Rosendale Valley and had 2 children, Harry and Charlotte. Her daughter later described her as fun-loving and completely without judgment. Professionally, Sadie had been extremely successful alongside her best friend. She had established a really successful medical communications company, a career that she had worked incredibly hard to build. Although she was beginning to think about retirement, she wasn't simply looking back on her life. There was still plenty that she was looking forward to, particularly spending more time with her children and eventually becoming a grandmother. Just days before her death, Sadie had received a phone call from her daughter Charlotte, who was in Hawaii, and the news was exactly what she wanted to hear. Her daughter was engaged to be married. Sadie was absolutely delighted, and the 2 women were already thinking about the wedding and all the planning that would come with it. Sadie also had a trip of her own planned. Her longtime partner Ian was skiing in Switzerland, and she was due to fly out to join him the following morning. This meant that on the evening of Thursday, the 14th of January, 2016, Sadie was at home packing her suitcase and preparing for the journey. It should have been an ordinary evening. Instead, shortly before 8 p.m., Sarah Williams arrived at her house. Williams had traveled from Chester in a blue Renault Clio. She parked away from the property and approached the house on foot with one hand inside her pocket. When Sadie answered the door, Williams used an illegal stun gun to incapacitate her before attacking her with a knife, inflicting more than 40 stab and slash wounds. The attack was over within minutes. Williams left the house and closed the door behind her, leaving Sadie lying on the hallway floor. The following day, Sadie's colleagues became concerned when she failed to arrive at work and didn't respond to messages, something that was completely out of character for her. A colleague contacted Lancashire Police and asked officers to carry out a welfare check. When they arrived at the house, nobody answered the door, but officers looked through a window in the letterbox and could see a woman lying on the hallway floor. They forced their way inside and discovered that Sadie had been killed. Ian returned from Switzerland devastated, but detectives quickly established that he could not have been responsible because he had been abroad when Sadie was killed. What Ian did have, however, was information that would change the direction of the investigation. He told police about the flowers, and he told them about Sarah Williams. Ian and Williams had known each other through an indoor ski center in Manchester, where Ian worked as a ski instructor and Williams sold skiing holidays. In 2013, they began an affair. The relationship eventually ended in October 2014 when Ian became increasingly concerned about what he saw as Williams's possessive behavior. But ending the affair did not mean that Williams was prepared to simply accept that it was over. She didn't. During the breakdown of the relationship, Williams contacted Sadie directly and revealed the affair to her in deliberately hurtful and explicit terms, clearly hoping to humiliate Sadie and cause her relationship with Ian to collapse. Instead, Ian confessed to what had happened, and he and Sadie decided to do their best to repair their relationship and continue their life together. However, Ian and Williams didn't completely stop communicating. Although the physical affair had ended, explicit messages and photographs continued to be exchanged. On the 4th of January 2016, just 10 days before Sadie was murdered, they exchanged around 30 explicit messages. Ian later said that he would regret those messages for the rest of his life. While his behavior had undoubtedly caused Sadie hurt, the responsibility for the murder lay with the two women who made the decision to carry it out. Ian did not know that Williams and her friend Katrina Walsh were planning to kill Sadie. Williams was 35 years old and lived in Chester, while Katrina Walsh, known as Kit, was 56 and worked as a horse riding instructor. The two women had known each other for years, and investigators would eventually discover that the murder had not been something they had suddenly decided to do that January. Walsh kept a detailed diary, and it soon became clear that the two had been discussing murder since August 2014 for almost 18 months. Walsh bought GPS tracking devices and placed one on Ian's car in an attempt to establish where he lived with Sadie. She created an email address, searched land registry records, and bought disposable phones. They also purchased a knife, oversized boots, and clothing intended to make identification more difficult. An old Renault was bought with cash, and its number plate was altered using black tape so that a 3 appeared to be an 8. In December 2015, Williams and Walsh traveled to Germany, where they bought a stun gun that was illegal in Britain and successfully brought it back. By this point, this was no longer a vague fantasy or an angry conversation between two people. There had been months in which they could have stopped and abandoned the idea, but instead, they continued making practical preparations. Then came the flowers. On the 7th of January 2016, Williams and Walsh drove to Helmshaw and bought the chrysanthemums at Tesco's. Walsh, wearing a cap and a hood, then walked to Sadie's home and asked if she was Mrs. Hartley. When Sadie said yes, Walsh handed over the flowers and left. The purpose of this visit was now clear. They had confirmed that this was Sadie's home. They had seen her answer the door, and they knew that Ian was going to be abroad. A week later, Sarah Williams returned on her own. The police investigation initially had little obvious to work with. Nothing appeared to have been stolen from the house. Sadie had no enemies. There was no obvious sign of forced entry, and there seemed to be no immediate explanation as to why someone would want to hurt her. Investigators began looking at CCTV footage from surrounding properties. The road where Sadie lived on Sunnybank Road was relatively secluded, but several houses had security cameras, and one vehicle quickly stood out. A blue Renault Clio had driven slowly into the road shortly before 8 p.m., turned around, and parked some distance from Sadie's house. A short time later, a figure walked towards the property. Around 4.5 minutes later, that same figure could be seen returning towards the car. Police now believed they had captured the killer on camera. Ian told detectives about Sarah Williams and her previous relationship with him, explaining that she had become increasingly obsessive after the affair ended. Then, investigators found something particularly significant. Mobile phone evidence showed that Williams's phone had been in the Helmshaw area on the night that Sadie was killed, despite Williams living around 60 miles away. Williams was arrested at her home in the early hours. Initially, she denied killing Sadie and claimed she had been sent home from work with a stomach bug before going to bed. The evidence, however, soon began to dismantle that account. CCTV showed Williams leaving her home wearing outdoor clothing, while forensic officers noticed a strong smell of bleach in her bathroom. The bathroom appeared to have been carefully cleaned, apart from one diluted spot of blood, and this blood belonged to Sadie. Police also discovered an old Nokia phone hidden beneath Williams's bed. Calls from that phone connected her to her workplace and to Sadie's workplace in the period before the murder, while other numbers were connected to people selling used cars. Eventually, investigators traced the seller of the blue Renault Clio. There was a problem, though, because automatic number plate recognition cameras appeared to be identifying the wrong vehicle. An officer examining the images realized what had happened. The number plate had been altered, so the 8 was actually a 3. Once the correct registration was entered, police traced the Renault to a car park about 55 miles from Helmshaw. The tape had been removed from the plate, but traces of adhesive remained, and forensic officers found Sadie's blood inside the car. The vehicle, which had been intended to help conceal the killer's movements, had instead provided investigators with another important link to Williams. As the evidence against her mounted, Williams stopped answering questions and responded with no comment. Police then turned their attention to her friend, Katrina Walsh. CCTV showed Williams buying the flowers with another woman wearing a cap, while cell site evidence placed both women's phones in Helmshaw that night. When Walsh was arrested, she claimed to have a memory problem, saying that events disappeared from her memory after 3 sleeps unless she had written them down. She also immediately began pointing the finger at Williams. Walsh gave the impression that she had simply been manipulated. Although she eventually admitted that she had delivered the flowers, she later told police that evidence had been hidden at the farm where she worked with horses. Officers searched the area, and beneath mud and horse manure, they recovered the knife, a car key, and the stun gun. The stun gun was missing one of its darts, which had been found at Sadie's home caught in the roll neck of her jumper. Although Walsh continued to portray herself as someone who had been frightened and manipulated, investigators found something that made that explanation increasingly difficult to sustain. They discovered years of diaries she had kept, which showed the opposite. One entry described how she was excited at the prospect of plotting the perfect murder. Another stated that she had no moral qualms, only a concern about not getting caught. Williams had carried out the attack, but Walsh had helped make it possible. Both women were charged with murder, and their trial began at Preston Crown Court in July 2016 and lasted for about 7 weeks. Both pleaded not guilty, and each attempted to blame the other. Harry and Charlotte attended court as the final months of their mother's life were reconstructed through the evidence. Charlotte explained that she wanted to be there because she hoped that understanding what had happened might somehow help her understand why it had happened. In August 2016, both Sarah Williams and Katrina Walsh were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Williams was ordered to serve a minimum of 30 years, while Walsh received a minimum term of 25 years. The judge was particularly clear about one point that had been widely misreported by the media during the case. This was not a crime of passion. It wasn't a love triangle. It was a planned killing involving months of preparation. The judge described it as a crime of obsession, arrogance, and barbarity. That distinction matters because there had been countless opportunities for the plan to stop, but it didn't. Following the convictions, Sadie's son, Harry, spoke movingly about the woman his mother had been and described her as lovely, fun, trustworthy, intelligent, kind, and loving. He spoke about the things she would now miss, including Charlotte's forthcoming wedding, future grandchildren, birthdays, Christmases, and all those ordinary family milestones that families experience and that would continue without her. He also spoke about the enormous toll that the investigation, the trial, and the subsequent media coverage had taken on the family. Although they had received some justice through the convictions and sentences, it could never be enough because it would never bring back their mother. Perhaps the most disturbing part of the case is that Sadie did sense that something wasn't right when the flowers arrived. But there was simply no way she could have understood what that feeling meant. She couldn't have known that somebody else had become so obsessed that they were prepared to kill her. While all of that was happening, Sadie was simply getting on with her life, making plans for the future, and preparing for a trip that she believed was only the beginning of another chapter. And that brings us to the end of this case here on Docket Unsealed. The evidence may have provided answers, but the story also leaves behind questions that can stay with us long after the investigation is over. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to follow the case with us. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, sometimes the smallest detail can reveal the biggest truth. This is Docket Unsealed.